So here we have this story about people entering into the Americas, coming through an ice-free corridor, hunting big elephants with large weaponry. It appeals to, the Euro-American manifest destiny view of the West, right? But is it an accurate representation of what actually occurred in the past? Well, if the last 15 years are any gauge, the story may be much, much more complicated than that. Data from South America first began to accumulate in ways that at first didn't make sense to a lot of people working in North America. You had sites being discovered on the coast, near the coast of Chile, sites in the Amazon. You had coastal Peruvian shell middens, and then the site at Monteverde. You can see here, down towards the bottom of South America, bottom right of this map, you can see where Monteverde is located. This was the site that received enough attention from Tom Dillahay and his Chilean colleagues and was excavated with careful attention to detail, careful attention to the use of dating methods, so that it became the first site in the Americas that dated earlier than the Clovis sites of North America that was well accepted by the scientific community. But even when that work was well accepted, it was still difficult for people to comprehend how do we get people all the way down to the southern tip of South America before we have people hunting elephants in New Mexico. And so it ushered in a time period, which I think we're still in many ways, in the study of the peopling of the New World, where scholars are genuinely trying to come up with coherent models to explain things instead of just falling back on the older ideas, which now became harder and harder to maintain. Their simplicity was elegant and their simplicity was attractive in many ways, but it failed to accurately capture what was going on. And just as happens in many different fields of scientific endeavor, the new data that are recovered require us to come up with new ideas and new models to explain that new data. Here you can see some pictures from the site of Pedra Pintada in Brazil, where some of the earliest occupation there dates to 12,800. It's contemporary with the mammoth hunters in New Mexico, and yet it's all the way down in the Brazilian Amazon. You can see the very clear stratigraphic profiles that were recovered from this site. In addition to the really old dates that interest us here because we're talking about peopling of the New World, there's some of the oldest ceramics in the New World have actually been recovered from this site as well, suggesting that the earliest tradition of ceramic pottery technology in the Americas was not in Peru, was not in central Mexico, was not in the southeast. The earliest tradition of pottery in the Americas actually emerged in the Amazon. It's a whole other story here, but just as an interesting side note, same site producing that information. And there's a couple of videos about the work at Pedra Pintada in the Amazon that I'd like you to take a look at. They're also posted to the course website. Monteverde, Chile, whose earliest occupation dates to sometime before 14,000 years ago. So at least 1,000 years older than the oldest Clovis sites in New Mexico. And the thing that benefits Monteverde is that it's not just a handful of shell, some flakes. There's houses. They've recovered shoes, knots, pieces of leather tied into knots, unequivocal evidence of human activity, design, presence, and remarkable preservation of these perishable materials. They've even recovered these balls of seaweed from this wet preservation site. Unfortunately, another thing to point out, after a couple of decades of intensive work, Monteverde is one of those archaeological sites that has actually fallen victim to the impacts of climate change. Increased and unprecedented amounts of precipitation due to repeated La Nina events in this area actually resulted in massive flooding and erosion, and most of the archaeological site of Monteverde, which survived for 14,000 years in remarkable state of preservation. After 14,000 years, much of it has been washed away over the last 5 years. It's not the only site now that dates to this time range, so its loss is tragic, but we will be able to use that information to find additional sites that date to this age. But it is something to consider, that data and archaeological sites that have survived thousands and thousands and thousands of years are being lost at an increasing rate as we begin to see patterns of wind and current and precipitation change more rapidly than they have since the end of the last ice age. So it's not a theoretical matter anymore, it's empirically observable what those impacts can be, and the loss of information that we have to deal with. So we have to identify sites that are in danger of being lost and either do what we can to preserve them in place or do what we can to investigate them before they're lost. Here's some of the artifacts from Monteverde, just a small selection. The projectile point there, chipped out of stone, is remarkably well done. It has some caliche incrustation on it, so it's not as pretty as some of the ones from the Clovis site, but that's really, really difficult to do in a very tough stone. The stone on top is not just a natural stone, it's actually been pecked and formed into this shape. If you can come up with some ideas, that'd be great. It's not just a grinding stone, but it is a shaped, nearly spherical stone. And for some more information on some of these sites in Oregon, you can take a look at that one there that we're going to talk about here. The other site that's further north, that's slightly older than Monteverde, or around the same age, depending on which end of the statistical bars you want to look at, is Paisley 5 Mile Rock Shelter. It's about 14,500 years ago. The leader of the excavations there, Dr. Dennis Jenkins, is an excellent field archaeologist. The fantastic thing about Paisley Rock Shelter is the excellent preservation and the fine laminate stratigraphy that you can see in this photograph. But even more so was the fact that among the objects that were recovered at Paisley 5 Mile Rock Shelter were human coprolites. Not just one, but a couple dozen. And they were able to extract human DNA from these coprolites. And they went through every possible scientific protocol to ensure that there was not contamination. And when they extracted that DNA, the DNA from these 14 plus thousand year old human fecal matter, the DNA matches lineages common to Native American populations. Not European, not modern Northeast Asian, not African, not Australian, not Polynesian. The lineages match the four founding mitochondrial or maternal lineages found in today's Native American First Nations tribal communities. And this is huge in terms of what that tells us. Another really, really important site that has just in the last couple of years finally been fully published in the pages of Science and other first-tier peer-reviewed journals is that of Coopers Ferry, Idaho, shown right here in this photograph, the location. This is a photograph of field school students from Oregon State University at work in 2016. You can see the careful excavations. Here you can see some of the artifacts that were recovered. These, in particular, were all recovered from a single cache feature. A cache feature is where somebody takes a bunch of things, buries them all together in one spot, sometimes with the idea of coming back and getting them later. You know, it's like a storage, it's like a, you know, in modern times, it's your bus station locker. You know, you put your go bag in there and put the lock on it, and then if you ever need it, you come back and get it, right? That's the idea behind the word cache. Sometimes things get called caches, but they're not necessarily intended as a functional, practical cache. Sometimes things are ritually cached. They're buried, they're placed there as part of a ceremony. Whether that was the function of this particular one or not is hard to say at the moment. But all of these were found together in one spot, there at Coopers Ferry. Here you can see a map looking at the route. And the oldest dates that they have from the basal levels of Coopers Ferry are just shy of 16,000 years ago. Right now, as I speak these words, it's considered to be the oldest securely dated site in the Americas. You can see where the researchers on the project think the route for people to have arrived there. It makes a fair amount of sense. They're right there on the Columbia and Snake River drainage. It would have been a no real feat of navigation to arrive at this spot. You just follow the left bank of the river, the right bank of the river, all the way up to Coopers Ferry. But you can see it wouldn't have been that far from the edge of the ice. But this river would have been probably both the navigational tool and the lifeblood of the people who were living here at the very, very earliest, at the very dawn of human occupation of North America. These are just giving you some of the radiocarbon dates from the site, just so you get a sense that, again, it's not one anomalous result from a lab that's giving us this idea, but in fact a very well established range of dates that overlap in all kinds of ways and have been repeated over and over again. And there's also a video about this that's posted to the website, the course website, that I'd like you to take a look at. So 16,000 years, we're pretty solid on that. Could people have been here even earlier? Claims have been made last year that there were people 25,000 years ago in the high altitude elevations of Zacatecas in north central Mexico by Mexican archaeologist Ciprian Ardelian. This site and this material have yet to be fully examined and evaluated, but we'll see. We'll see. It'll be interesting as more information supporting these claims comes out. We've also seen claims made for 130,000-year-old mastodon remains in San Diego, claimed to have evidence of human activity. That one would surprise me way more than the site in Zacatecas, to be very honest with you. The site in Zacatecas would surprise the hell out of me. I might just, give up this research and do something else if the 130,000-year-old mastodon remains turned out to actually be evidence of human activity. Because if you recall from earlier lectures, we don't even have anatomically modern humans anywhere near the Americas that far back, which would mean that the folks in San Diego would have to be Denisovans rather than behaviorally modern humans. And there's no evidence for that in the record. Plus, you'd end up with, if people were here 130,000 years ago, what did they do for the first 115,000 years that didn't produce archaeological sites? It's tougher to make that claim. Here's a photograph of Chiquihuite Cave in Zacatecas that I mentioned, some of the excavations there. Here's the assemblage that has been press released from Chiquihuite Cave. It's very basic, to put it mildly. And if these people 25,000 years ago have made it all the way from the old world to high elevation sites in Zacatecas, I would almost expect them to have a technological tradition that was more robust, shall we say. Here are assemblages from African sites dating to the exact same time period. You've got shell beads and bone tools and red ochre and incredible rock art panels and grinding slicks and stones and all of these other very sophisticated kinds of materials. In Europe, on the left, you can see some of the traditions in Europe dating to this time period. On the right, these are technological traditions of Japan dating to that time period. So somehow, if people got here and went up into those high elevations and deposited that assemblage in Chiquihuite Cave, it was one of the more, it was one of the simpler, it would have had to have been one of the simpler and least refined technological traditions in existence during the Upper Paleolithic. And that in and of itself is one of the things that gives me a little bit of pause. New genetic studies that have emerged of both modern populations and archaeological populations suggest that one of the reasons for the distance genetically between Native American populations and Northeast Asian populations is that it was not, as we talked about, people sprinting across a land bridge and ending up in southern South America, right? You had a population expansion out of East Central Asia that involved the occupation of Beringia as a landmass unto itself. And then once people begin to spread down into the Americas, that Beringian population has already become genetically distinct from its ancestors further to the south and west in Asia. And some of this may have also occurred in the northern Japanese islands of Hokkaido and Sakhalin, right? And the Kuril Islands. And those populations may have been distinct enough that when they took part in the migrations into the Americas, they brought with them a genetic signature of a people who were already several thousand years separated from the people at Lake Baikal, the people in interior of Siberia, the people in Southeast Asia. They were already recognizably different. And this idea is referred to as the Beringian holdover. And I would like you to watch this video in association with this lecture relating to the questions of Native American genetics.